so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here at this important event. It's very important to have the awareness of the Uyghur genocide and the atrocities in this country, in the Islamic world, and worldwide. So it's now October 2024, which is 10 years since the second Xinjiang Central Work Forum in 2014, where under President Xi Jinping, fateful decisions were made about the crackdown on the so-called Uyghur Autonomous Region, or East Turkistan. I will be referring to it as Xinjiang for purely academic reasons, as a colonial Chinese-created entity in which these policies are executed and are investigated. It is also 7.5 years since the beginning of the unprecedented campaign of mass internment under Xinjiang Party Secretary Chen Quanguo. However, as of today, there's no accountability for the perpetrators. International mechanisms have been struggling to bring perpetrators to justice and to give full recognition to this terrible situation and these atrocities, this genocide. So I'll be starting by talking about the situation of forced labor, and then in my second part, I will be talking about the genocide and birth prevention and related mechanisms. Xinjiang operates two different systems of forced labor. Together, they constitute the world's largest systems of state-imposed forced labor effective in the world today. The first one is linked to the internment camps that began in 2018 and ran until it was actively operated until early 2020, and we estimate that several hundred thousand Uyghurs remain victims of the system as other Uyghurs were shifted into long-term imprisonment. The larger system of forced labor in Xinjiang, however, is the so-called poverty elevation through labor transfer, which affects over 2 million ethnic minorities in East Turkestan, most of them Uyghurs, and with a target on southern Xinjiang. Now, during his visit in August 2023 to East Turkestan, General Secretary Xi Jinping emphasized that while the region needed to develop, it should, quote, ensure development with stability, must always give top priority to maintaining stability, unquote. And that Xinjiang should promote the legalization and normalization of stability maintenance work. She also emphasized the need to consolidate and expand poverty alleviation achievement. These are expressions found in connection with the region's current policy on preventing a return to poverty, which is through forced labor, keeping Uyghurs in forced labor. They're not allowed to go home to their communities. This also shows that Xinjiang continues to place a very strong emphasis on stability, even over economic growth. Now, in December 2021, a new party secretary came into power, Ma Xingwei, replacing Chen Quanguo, shifting the region to a strategy of normalization and the institutionalization to maintain and increase forced labor placements, forced labor transfer of rural surplus laborers into factories operated mostly by Han Chinese in fields such as cotton production, textile production, polysilicon, many other sort of industrial sectors that are lower skilled. This represents a change of policy compared to Chen Quanguo, who tried to mobilize Uyghurs into forced labor. Now we see a maintenance and an intensification of forced labor. The 14th five-year plan, 2021 to 2025, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region instituted intensified employment and training requirements for targeted rural populations. In 2021 and 22, this increased labor transfer figures, and in 2023, we had a new record now of 3.2 million person times. So this is about 2.8 to 2.9 million individuals being transferred from the countryside to work mostly in factories or the service sector. Now, it is very significant that the International Labour Organization in Geneva as part of the United Nations Human Rights Mechanism and Civil Supervision Mechanism, has been interacting with China because in 2022 China signed on to 2 ILO conventions, number 29 and 105. China was confident enough to say that we can sign on to these conventions. This was under pressure from the European Union, who said there's forced labor in China, we want a comprehensive agreement on investment with China for economic and business relations, but there's forced labor allegation. So China signed on to 2 ILO conventions, and the ILO visited China in August 2022. Now the ILO has been developing indicators and a mechanism to assess forced labor since 2001 under the Special Action Program for Forced Labor, SAPFL. And the focus was on private forced labor because the ILO was saying state-imposed forced labor is declining in importance. It's no longer as important as it used to be. You know, the Gulag is closed, supposedly Chinese labor camps are closed, forced labor has become better. And so the ILO neglected to develop indicators for state-imposed forced labor effective to capture and to fully assess the situation in East Turkestan, in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Last year, I wrote a research article in the Journal of Human Trafficking, and I interviewed 3 senior ILO officials. And as a result, I was very critical of the ILO. I was very critical of the gaps, and I was very critical of their weak and inadequate attempt to assess Uyghur forced labor affecting Uyghurs. I said conceptually, the kind of forced labor that China is implementing in Turkestan is very secretive, clandestine, and hidden. It's called poverty elevation. And it does not, the bigger system, one system operates out of the camps, but the bigger system of forced labor in Xinjiang does not operate out of internment camps or prisons. It operates through the grassroots party apparatus and the poverty elevation mechanism. And you are not able to assess, and I call this non-internment state-imposed forced labor mobilization. And I said the ILO does not have a mechanism to effectively capture and assess and counter this type of forced labor. As a result of my criticism, and my research, which was widely noted and read in Geneva, in February this year, the International Labour Organization published an update of its handbook on the guidelines for the measurement of forced labor, which it first had published in 2012 as survey guidelines. In this updated handbook, the International Labour Organization took on all of my criticism, took on my suggestions, and improved its handbook considerably and added an entire chapter on state-imposed forced labor. Very important, in this handbook, the ILO now squarely mentions Beijing's forced labor in Xinjiang and Tibet. It does not mention China or Uyghurs or Xinjiang, but it says that the labor transfer of ethnic minorities is a form of forced labor. And labor transfer is a technical term from the Chinese term, 转移就业, and that one only exists in China. So without using the word China, the new handbook directly points and says Uyghur forced labor is state-imposed forced labor. This is a very important development for the Uyghur cause. The handbook says that the forced labor of ethnic minorities for relocation is a form of state-imposed forced labor. And it also says that state-imposed forced labor can be assessed through evidence of a state policy, a policy that uses employment or work for political purposes, including aligning the political views of the population with those of the state, the established political system, or altering the population composition in particular areas, or enhancing national security. There's 3 references here. These are all very important. And the ILO was able to take them from my work. In 2021, I published articles saying that China was using labor transfer to change the population composition of Uyghurs in southern East Turkestan. And I also said in 2023, I published work saying the primary motivation for forced labor in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is not only economic, but it's first political, then economic exploitation. Because Xi Jinping himself said in 2014 that there's a risk to the national security of China when Uyghurs are not in full-time work. And so I said to the ILO, your indicators are measuring economic exploitation, but what China is doing to the Uyghurs and to the Tibetans is political exploitation and economic exploitation, and it's doing it to change the population structure, to reduce the percentage of Uyghurs in their homeland and in southern Xinjiang. And therefore, this language is very significant that we now find in the International Labour Organization handbook. Especially noteworthy is the referring to altering the population composition, which refers to state policies to, quote, optimize the ethnic population ratio by ending, quote, the dominance of Uyghur population groups and increasing numbers of Han Chinese settlers. In 2017, Beijing instituted a new policy mandating an increase in southern Xinjiang's Han Chinese settler population by 300,000 between 2017 and 2022. Chinese scholar officials have confirmed that labor transfers to other regions of Uyghurs to other provinces are designed to reduce the density of concentrated Uyghur populations. And research that I published earlier this year found that transfers of Uyghurs to other regions increased by 38% in 2023, from about 25,000 per year to about 38,000 or 39,000 per year. The ILO handbook also adds an entire chapter, a 23-page section on measuring state-imposed forced labor. To quote, in contrast to most forms of forced labor, state-imposed forced labor operates through a pervasively coercive, wider social context marked by lack of freedom and a state apparatus or government bureaucracy that generates powerful force and coercive pressure. Non-cooperation entails a systemic risk that's often more implicit than open, so more hidden than open. This conceptual framing, the ILO adopted from my article in the Journal of Human Trafficking, showing why forced labor is difficult to conceptualize and even harder to measure. However, Beijing actively paralyzes the actual work of the ILO in Geneva. So the ILO is now is in conversations, and I talked with the officials in spring this year in Geneva, and they are in conversations with officials in Beijing. They even visited, and Ma Xing-wei gave them a lecture in Xinjiang, gave them a lecture on the benefits of poverty elevation and development. But the problem is the Chinese are calling it poverty elevation. Now, Beijing has been actively paralyzing the multilateral institutions in Geneva, including the International Labour Organization. In 2023, China was going to be one of the countries to be examined by the ILO, but it was not. It was not selected. Beijing prevented it from being selected for examination. And it did this because the ILO is a tripartite mechanism: employers, employees, and states, governments. And it was the employers, the business people, the ones who do business in China also. They said, no, we don't select China. So China was able to put pressure on and prevent being selected for examination. Now, the international trade union associations, they're going to make a submission of evidence of Uyghur forced labor to the Committee of Experts of the International Labour Organization in December this year. It's going to be examined, and they will publish a report in February next year. And there will be further negotiation between the ILO and Beijing in 2025, but it will not, again, there's not an opportunity for it to be examined until 2026, because that was rejected in 2023. So it's been very difficult because Beijing has been able to influence the people. And therefore, to remove pressure, and that's why we need to see this as a long-term effort here. We cannot be discouraged just because they were not selected. We cannot be discouraged because China refused to cooperate. This is a long-term effort. Now, in my second part here, Beijing has also instituted policies in the region that constitute genocide under the 1948 UN Convention. How are we to assess this? In 2014, the UN Office for Genocide Prevention identified risk factors for atrocity crimes in its framework for analysis for atrocity crimes. Risk factor 10 provides indicators for signs of an intent to destroy and hold apart a protected group. In the document's introduction, then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon notes that, quote, atrocity crimes are not spontaneous or isolated events, they are processes with histories, precursors, and trigger factors. So that's what we have. We have in East Turkistan, in Xinjiang, we have evidence of an ongoing genocide and the risk of an ongoing genocide. Why? First, we have numbers. We have numbers that birth rates decline dramatically in the region by over 60% and natural population growth falling by around 80% between 2015 and 18. In 2019, the birth rates for the whole autonomous region declined by a further 50% in 2018. Since then, Xinjiang no longer publishes the data for Uyghur region birth rates. It's withholding data. Withholding of data is a risk indicator for an ongoing genocide through birth prevention. We also have, and I published recently in the Cambridge Journal out of Cambridge University of Law, Politics and Art, an article documenting systematic sexual violence in the camps and outside the camps. Sexual violence and Chinese attacks on Uyghur women's ability to reproduce in various ways. And I'll spare you the details, including through insertion of intrauterine devices, sterilization, and rape. And these attacks together are also a risk indicator of genocide and are targeted at the Uyghur population. The Xinjiang papers from 2014, with secret speeches by Xi Jinping, provide insight into the intent behind the destruction that is part of the Genocide Convention, namely where Xi Jinping talks about the need to optimize the ethnic population structure, or that the ethnic population structure is a matter of national security. So, Beijing's policies of birth prevention and sterilization and attacks on Uyghur reproductive capacity are designed A, to safeguard China's national security, achieve the politically important two centennial goals, the two most important political goals of China in the 21st century, and therefore the long-term rule of the CCP. Unfortunately, only one independent legal assessment has been implemented by the Uyghur Tribunal in London. The US government made a genocide determination in January 2021. Otherwise, around 10 national parliaments have declared it to be genocide, but that is not an independent or legal determination, and has, in my opinion, limited impact on the Uyghur cause. Key here is to use the UN Convention for the Prevention of Genocide. For example, a member case can bring a case against another member country. One example is the Gambia. The Gambia in Africa, brought a case against Myanmar over the Rohingya. And this is now being reviewed by the International Court. They are all signatories of the Genocide Convention. This shows that there needs to be a country at the United Nations in Geneva to bring a case of genocide and crimes against humanity against China. Which country will do it? This, in my opinion, and this is my closing remarks, shows the importance of Muslim nations. Western countries have taken many measures, have made genocide determination or at least declaration. Western countries have published many letters in the United Nations about the Uyghurs. China, however, has been uniting the developing countries and produced counter letters denying the allegations. Among them are many Muslim countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Muslim world has failed to support the Uyghurs. One example is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. In August 2023, a delegation of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation visited China and praised the country as, quote, a great country that has scored remarkable achievements in its economic and social development, and said that the OIC will further expand its cooperation with China. The delegation visited East Turkistan, and Mr. Bama Krama, the head of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation delegation, praised, quote, the prosperity and development of China's Xinjiang under good governance. In 2019, the OIC adopted a resolution commending China's efforts providing care to its Muslim citizens. This was in 2019, when all of us knew that Uyghurs were being put into camps. China also supports Palestine, gaining support of the Muslim world over the Gaza-Israel conflict. It is, in my opinion, paramount for this cause that we take a long-term strategy towards increasing awareness, especially amongst Muslim countries, and that Muslim states, including those who are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, are supporting other, including Western countries, over the rights of the Uyghurs and using international mechanisms in Geneva, including at the International Court, for the Genocide Convention, at the International Labour Organization, and at other, like the rights of women, and so on, to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable over the genocide, forced labor, and sexual attacks targeting Uyghurs.